So welcome everyone to Selling Soap, Smashing Sexism, and Seeing Ourselves with Rabbi Mike Rothbaum, who is one of my mentors and colleagues and a brilliant educator. So I'm excited that you have the chance to learn with him today. Before we jump into the sort of meat of the program, I just want to say a few things about JWA. And you are all at varying levels familiar with our work, but our mission is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agents of change. We do this as a public history organization by sharing not just primary source documents, but also blog articles and convening these kinds of events. And educators are our essential partners in that work. So without you sharing these stories on the ground and really making known these stories and sharing them with your students, we really wouldn't be able to do this work. So we're happy to have you here and sharing in this conversation with us. We'll be talking a little bit also at the end of the day about the Twersky Award, which is named for the mother of our founding director, Gail Twersky Reamer. And Natalia Twersky was her mother. And this prize is really to honor and recognize the work that educators are doing in our network and sort of hold up examples of people who are doing really incredible work and who are engaging with women's voices and asking their students to consider women's experiences in a way that is meaningful and resonant and deep. So you'll see an example of that today. And so I would like to introduce Rabbi Mike Rothbaum, who is a rabbi and educator in California. Mike also does a lot of social justice work and is an incredible writer on the topic of justice and Judaism. And I've been following your posts all week as events are unfolding in Baltimore and across the country in really helping push the envelope in the Jewish community and thinking about how we engage with big questions around justice, whether it's about labor rights or feminism and sexism or racism. So we are really honored to have you here and for you to share a little bit with us about what you put together. And yeah, so you should just tell me if you want me to switch the slide, and I'm happy to drive for you, but it's your show.
All right, thank you so much. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Volume's good? All right. So first of all, thank you so much to Etta, who is a mentor of mine and a teacher of mine for a while now. And thank you so much to the Jewish Women's Archives for being an amazing resource that I go to on a regular basis for work that I do with kids and adults, and for raising up voices that are otherwise not heard, not just women's voices, although primarily women's voices. There's all sorts of great resources. Pirkei Avot says that you need to have Torah im derech eretz, Torah together with the way of the land, or with proper conduct, or with somehow engaging with haaretz, with the land that you're in. And Jews, sometimes in silos and sometimes in buildings and camps, whatever the building is, get lost and forget that there's an outside world. And Jewish Women's Archive has been, I think, on the forefront of breaking down that wall between the inside and the outside. So I'm so grateful and so blessed to work with you guys still, continually. You mentioned, Etta, you mentioned what's going on this week in Baltimore, and so I'm going to go off the rails a little bit. I hope it's okay. I think it's relevant. This week's Haftarah portion is from the book of Amos, and the first thing he says, he's like mid rant. He's like yelling at the Israelites, and he says, "Are the Ethiopians not like the Israelites to me, O Israel, says God," right? Like, I got you out of Egypt, but I get people out of bondage and oppression all the time. That's actually what I do, says God. You know, I know, like, the Egypt story is like that's a big deal for y'all, but that's what I do. If God had a business card, it would be like, God, frees slaves. That's what I do. And so, if the Jewish community isn't looking at an oppressed community in Baltimore and in cities across the country and not making that connection, that God doesn't just free us from Egypt, but also is deeply involved and pained and engaged in a justice struggle in there as well, then we're missing that. And even in our own communities, besides Jews of color who are part of our communities, there's a good 50+% of the Jewish world that is women, right? That we don't, Jewish history is not often women's history. When we talk about Jewish art, as we're going to talk about today, we think of Mark Rothko and Mark Chagall. I got Mark Chagall right back there, right? But where are the Jewish women artists, and where is the struggle in our community to engage with that issue, and why is this not like a hugely exciting webinar to be a part of for many, many people? Why is it a small group of four women who have joined this call? I think there's a lot of work to do inside of our communities. And so when I got the chance in Contra Costa County's Midrashah program, which is a community Hebrew high school in the East Bay area, I wanted to teach some art. I wanted to teach kids about Jewish artists and what does it mean to do Jewish art, and let's try and make some Jewish art. I had to make a conscious decision, like, not to fall in that stupid man trap of like only talking about men. So immediately thought of Jewish Women's Archives to help me out with that, because I know that they're a good resource, and I immediately then thought of Barbara Kruger. So we can go to the next slide. If you don't know who Barbara Kruger is, you should, because she's like such a super Jewish artist. And why is that? Because she's in your face, because she knocks down idols, because she uses text, and because she makes you think. In particular, she's addressed issues of messaging in the world related to politics and advertising, and forced us in using very stark actual text in her artwork to really say, what is the messaging that's in this piece, and what is the messaging that I receive every day? What's the communication that I get every day, just walking through the world, that I might not even think about, and how am I affected by it in ways that I don't even realize? So she kind of tears off the veil and says, let's take a look at that. Where do we see this kind of messaging in Judaism? It goes back to the earliest parts of who we are in a nice little scroll we call the Torah. So what I wanted to do with kids was to say, let's take a look at this work that is like super in your face, that's really making you look at underlying assumptions in the world, and using text to do it. And we have an idol-smashing heritage of text that goes back, and it's called Torah, and let's make that connection. And let's, in the meantime, take a look at, in particular, how women are affected by these messages. So I think we can keep going. What are the messages that we do receive about women? Oh, what a beautiful slide that you've made, Etta. This is awesome.
Thank you.
What are the messages? Etta and I worked on this together, and up until the very last moment, and she's done such an awesome job. What are the messages that we receive about Jewish women? There's not a lot of folks that are like, oh, Jewish women, just like Devorah the prophetess. Like, oh, Jewish women, Emma Lazarus who put the poem on the Statue of Liberty. I mean, some people talk about that, but, most mass-consumed messages about women tend to fall into two categories. And we're going to go out on a limb here and say you've got the Yiddish mama, You've got, and you see Molly Goldberg there. She's loving. She takes care of her family. She's a balabusta. She's, she's tough but cuddly. Think about Gertrude Berg, who is playing Molly Goldberg, who is this amazing kick butt businesswoman out in the world, and she dresses herself up to be like, oh, she's the Yiddish mama. She's comfy and loving. Not that those are mutually exclusive, to be tough and to be loving, but that's one vision we've got of Jewish women. The other vision we've got is the word that we have this complicated relationship with. We may hate it, we may use it, we may hate it and use it. The Jap stereotype, right? Materialistic, selfish, sexually unavailable. I mean, this very peculiar, harsh, ugly stereotype of Jewish women. And what if you don't fit into one of those categories? Or what if you do sometimes, and that's how you're completely identified in your entire life? I'm obviously talking to people who have more of a direct experience of this than I do. I'm just as an outsider and an ally. That's a lot of what I see. And so, okay, so now we've got a lot of building blocks here. We've got the idea of breaking down messages from the bigger culture. We've got the idea of text being incredibly powerful, and sometimes it's overt and sometimes it's implied. And we've got womanhood and Jewish womanhood being boxed into certain categories. And here we go. Let's keep going. Like I said, I am blessed to work in Contra Costa Midrashah, a community high school program. I got to teach Jewish art and Jewish artists for grades 8 through 12, and this was a lesson we developed over the course of 3 sessions. So, how did we do this? We started with a trigger activity that I think we're going to go through a little bit, right? Do I have? Yeah, okay. Look at general before we talk about Jewishness. Just what are images of women in advertising? Because advertising is one of the main ways, like we talked about, that these messages subtly or not so subtly are delivered to women and to men about women. Get that conversation going, and then take a shift then to look at Barbara Kruger and her work and her investigation of those tropes, those ideas, those challenges, and then to look at Torah. And again, these messages that Barbara Kruger puts out, I think, come from a textual tradition in Judaism of loving text, of getting into text and digging through it and seeing how it relates to the world. And then to make some art. And I think we're going to talk about that in momentarily. Okay, so let's keep going.
You wanted to talk a little bit, I think, Rabbi Mike, about how you set up your room and sort of put things out. Do you want to do that now or later when we're looking at stuff?
Yeah. Oh, well, what do you think? What makes more sense?
I think now is good. Then we can sort of visualize it as we go into the lesson.
Okay, so once we talked about these images and processed the images and processed what Barbara Kruger was trying to do with her work, I then took, the great religious school standby, the stack of old magazines, right? Cut out pictures and make a collage, right? But these, I was specifically asking the kids to look for images that were evocative of messages that were deeper than what they saw, and not all of them did this, to look for messages about women. So some of them focused on just something that drew them in, just emotionally, and some found images of women. And then I had quotes from the Torah that were in the style of Barbara Kruger. And if you don't know the style of Barbara Kruger's use of text, we'll see it in a second. And then the challenge was to combine them and to make their own Kruger Torah, as we called it. So
awesome. Thank you.
Trigger. Yeah, thank you. So the trigger question, have you ever been affected by a picture or a message in an advertisement? Did it make you feel something about yourself? Etta, should we be like allowing people to respond to this, or am I just
Yeah.
doing a monologue? So we're allowing, so yeah, so for Francis, Miriam, Paula, and Susan, have you ever been affected by a picture or a message in an advertisement? And did it have an effect on your self-image?
Say a little bit more for us, Susan, about what you saw and how it affected you. I'll write something in too, I think.
Or anyone. Oh. Mm-hmm.
So Susan writing in that weight loss ads made her feel overweight and like she needed to take control, whereas the gym ads made her feel lazy. So Paula saying, you know, an ad telling her how she's supposed to look now that she's 50 was a bit disconcerting because it felt disconnected to her reality. Um, and Miriam saying more so by TV ads, trying to think of something specific. And Francis writing in saying, now that I'm over 55, I'm noticing more ads about couple matching services and products for older women that we are still supposed to buy into what marketers think we should look like. So, yeah, it's real.
Yeah, great minds think alike. Yeah, I got that. I think there's also great souls who do deep work are affected by messaging about who you are that says nothing about who you are. You know, people have said it, I'm not the first to say it, but like you can just see the conversations that happen about Hillary Clinton, whatever we think about her politics, right? What does her hair look like? What do her clothes look like? The whole pantsuit thing, right? Like, we don't talk about John McCain's pantsuits, right? We don't talk about, you know, we don't talk about how Bill Clinton wore his hair, right?
Right.
Hair. So I think, again, the message to women and girls that how that their worth is based on what they look like. Okay, so I'm gonna, and thanks folks on the call for jumping in deeply about things that are painful. So this is what we started to do. I took advertisements, classic advertisements from America, from the United States, and I invited the kids to just take a look at them and take them in. And how did they feel looking at these advertisements? What were the emotions that they brought up? And who was the speaker in the advertisement? And who was the audience?
Mm.
And once you got this sense of like, who's talking to who here? Where does that person get his or her authority? Where does that come from that this person can tell me?
Do you want to look at these all together or pick one to talk about together, Mike?
It's a good question. I think, you know what, what we did is I let kids just process them without me talking, so maybe I'll shut up and let you do that.
Okay, great. And I'll start at the first one and give us like 15 or 20 seconds on each one, and then people can write into the chat as we go.
Great. Miriam, yeah. I mean, it's clear that some of these are super old, but I think, like some people are saying in the chat, the messages have maybe gotten a little more sophisticated, but haven't necessarily changed.
Okay, so here are the discussion questions.
Right. So we've done this a little bit already, and yeah, the reactions that you had are, for the most part, the reactions that the kids had. It was interesting that one of the first things that happened was that so we have a range of 8th grade to 12th grade in the elective. That some of the younger boys actually were like, well, isn't being a car a cool thing? Like, I would want to be a Maserati, maybe not a Subaru, right? So
Right.
the fact that objectification was happening, it wasn't super clear that that was necessarily a bad thing. And I think it's interesting. So, an 8th grade boy isn't always self-aware about a sexist view that he has. But that commodification and objectification of human beings, I think, with advertising being as sophisticated as it is actually stretched into the male realm as well. And there was a lot of good conversation with a particularly strong and powerful young Jewish woman who was like, you wouldn't want to be compared to a car, you wouldn't want to be compared to an object, and this particular young man really had to struggle with it. It was some good conversation.
I also,
go ahead.
Can I just jump in and say, I really, when I read the lesson, I loved the question of who is speaking and where do they get their authority? Yeah. Because I think that question helps us turn to, okay, this is actually an advertiser, right? Somebody who gets paid to sell stuff is telling us these things. And one way of looking at it is that we give them that authority when we listen, right? And when we buy into it and when we consume things. Right. And also that they get their authority because they're paid by corporations or companies to do that work. And I think it helps us to turn the conversation away from to move on from how does this affect me to how is this a larger cultural and structural problem when we think about authority that way.
Right, and that was where we ended up going, was who's speaking in the advertisement was like, oh yeah, they just want us to buy stuff, exactly like you said. But then, okay, so what is the advertiser, what voice is the advertiser putting on, right? Like, who is the advertiser playing? So, if you think about the car ad, right? Yearns to be tamed like an animal. Right? Learns to be like a spirited woman who yearns to be tamed. Like, who is talking to who there? I don't think Miriam is going to say to Paula, hey, I've got this Subaru, and I love it. It's like a spirited woman who yearns to be tamed, right? Susan, yeah, it's aimed at men, right? And right, it's totally Mad Men, right? And so I'm a huge Mad Men fan. So this was I was like, oh, I want to talk about messaging and imaging, and just looking at these old ads was like, oh, this is so fun. Right, we've got it. So the advertiser writes ad copy and writes and comes up with a picture and says, oh, I'm going to sell this car to men, and I'm going to talk like a man who's talking to another man. Certainly implied straight man, right? And so where does, if you look at this picture, where does the authority come from? Who says that, let's kind of put it together in a big clump. Who says Subaru gets to talk to men to talk as a man to another man about women? Where does that idea come from?
Hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Susan is writing in that it's societal norms, um, and also targeting men because they were the breadwinners or people who were, the big money makers. Paul is also writing in here. Paul is saying how else to get men to buy cards, by leveraging sex, and Francis saying putting women back in their place after they had bigger roles during World War One. I'm also thinking about,
World War
and
Two,
World War
yeah.
Two, Francis says.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about, actually, I was reading, so Shavuot is coming up in a few weeks, and I was reading about Ruth yesterday. And in the book of Ruth, there are a few chapters where Ruth actually isn't even in it at all, and it's just people talking about Ruth. And it actually strikes me, when you asked the question that way, Rabbi Mike, it struck me as like this parallel of like, actually a lot of the time, most of the time in the Torah that we're hearing about women, they're being referred to by other characters in the Torah rather than speaking for themselves.
Right. Right. If you marry a woman and she displeases you, this is the proper way to divorce her. Right. That's in Deuteronomy, and right, we think, oh, that's nice that there's, progressive ways of divorcing women in Torah. That's compared to ancient Near East societies. That's really great, and it is really great, and it's also a text talking to men about women. Right. That's why when you see like a story like Benot Zelophehad, the daughters of Zelophehad, who come forward and say, like, our father had a portion of the land, and then he died without sons, and we should have land as well. We should be able to inherit that land, and they're actually named, right? Like, for a woman in the Torah to be named and speak about herself is it's a pretty big deal, and it's a big deal because it's rare, right? So getting the kids to look at the advertisements was a way to start to get them to think about authority and who speaks about who, and where do they get that authority to do that. So that was, a big chunk of our first lesson, and Daughters of Zelophehad, there you go. And then we transitioned into Barbara Kruger, who is a badass Jewish woman artist. So she, whoops, I'm still here. She takes these tropes of advertising, of getting you to pay attention, of provoking you, of getting you to look at text, of getting you to be engaged in text, and figuring out how to interpret that text, how to focus on where it's getting its authority, the messages that it's sending you. And she does that in incredibly provocative ways, and that's one of the reasons that she's fantastic.
So I have 4 images of hers here for us to look at.
Okay, so I'm going to just step away for a second. I'm going to have you just take those in. Hold on one second.
So I'll scroll through each of these and give everyone a chance to look and respond, just like we did with the advertising. Yeah. So a lot of people writing in having strong reactions to all of these images. Susan held up in the first image that the media sort of creates this situation where women's bodies end up being a battleground for these debates that we're having, or that women have to wage battle to protect themselves from these kinds of advertising. Paula saying that she actually loves the "I shop, therefore I am" piece, which I think it's pretty sassy, and I like it for that reason too. And Susan asked a question about, what about people who don't have the resources to shop, or who don't want to define themselves or can't define themselves in that way, and how does this sort of position them? Um, and then we also had a few people writing in talking just about how these are, how powerful these are, and sort of the juxtaposition of text and image here. And this last piece, particularly in light of current events going on in the racial justice and Black Lives Matter movement, seems like a strong message.
Right, and it's interesting how powerful her artwork is, right? Because I think, I could be wrong, but I think these particular pieces were created in different contexts. So that your body is a battleground. If we could go back to that. I believe that Kruger created this around an abortion rights campaign. That what a woman chooses to do with her body was open up for political discussion, right? And it was a political battleground. But it's so applicable, right? It's so not applicable. It's so it applies in different places, right? So if we talk about what your body looks like, if we talk about going back to the Torah about, you know, how women's bodies are talked about in terms of halakha, very malleable. The flag piece that she did, I believe, was done around an American foreign war. I believe that this had to do with Middle Eastern war, right? Iraq, I think. So patriotism and American pride turning into contempt, and putting it in the form of the American flag, which is so evocative, right? Which is so like, I'm proud, I salute the flag with my hand, right? Bring it home. Talk about what's going on in Baltimore, what's happened in Ferguson and Staten Island, and all over the country. It applies too. Immediately, we had a lot of conversation in class. It's what people are saying, how the stuff is making them feel. The "I shop, therefore I am" piece, a whole conversation about consumerism, right? Well, you know, that's wrong. That's not true. That doesn't make you who you are. And like, okay, right? So you're reacting to it. Some people like kind of got the joke, right? Or got the, you know, like, oh, that's not a good thing, but that's sort of an American characteristic, that we define who we are by the things that we buy, right? Wow, let's take a look at that. Let's, you know, do you think that's true? How does it make you feel? That you could express your values or your opinions based on a purchase. What does that say about what it means to have an opinion, what it means to be political, what it means to be a person who has a stake in what happens in a space? The "you construct elaborate rituals" piece, which, I mean, this is funny, right? I mean, this makes me laugh. This is a funny thing. Kruger is a funny artist, right? So you've got a bunch of dudes who are like, you know, roughhousing, and they're adults, and we talked about, this is one of the, you know, this is a piece that's by a woman for men, right? So that's unusual. Certainly in the artistic realm, where men are the subject and the woman is the commentator or the artist who's evaluating and processing that. Men have trouble touching each other without being concerned about being called gay, and the lengths that they'll go to create rituals or create some sort of process to touch each other. That's a great conversation for teenagers. This is also for kids struggling with sexuality issues. Right. So, questions that we raised, I think we've covered them, but I think we've got a slide. No, actually, not all of them. Okay, so how is this similar to the advertisements that we looked at, and how are they different? So put that question out to the group. Similarities, I think there's some of them that are obvious. Knowing the source and context is important, right? They're provocative. I think on a basic level, she hits us over the head. Well, I don't think I'm not sure everybody gets them right away. I mean, the basic thing that we can draw kids out on and draw ourselves on is they use text, right? They use images and text to make us think and to invite us to take a particular position, right? The difference...
Right, there's...
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say there's something there also about, like, an advertisement and Barbara Kruger's art. Like, something that sets Barbara Kruger's art apart from other artists' work is that she's intentionally sort of trying to evoke something that I feel like is beyond an idea, right? That there's something about being action-oriented, right, that I think her work has in common with advertisements.
Right. So that's good. This difference from other artists. The difference between these and the advertisements, one big difference, obviously, is that she doesn't want you to spend money on anything necessarily, and that, again, to take that idea out that advertisements are trying to separate you from your money, and they're playing on very deep emotions and issues of identity. To sell something, it must be art, is very powerful. And then here's somebody who's using the techniques of selling and saying, I don't want you to buy anything except to have a conversation about these ideas. You guys are having better conversations than I am. That's not fair. So we've talked about some of the middle two bullets.
Do you want to look at the... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, did you want to look at some of the statements we have that Barbara Kruger made about her work?
Oh, yeah. Let's skip to that in the interest of time. So, my work is about how people are with each other. You know, actually, Etta, can you read them since it would be in a voice of a woman instead of a voice of a man?
Sure. So these are some things that Barbara Kruger has said about her work in different articles. She says, my work is about how people are with each other. It's about social relations. I'm using aggressiveness and direct address to foreground that. It's what we do to each other. She also says it's about fear of difference and wanting to destroy it. From road rage to war, the behavior is not that dissimilar. Whether it is a battle around issues of race or aesthetics, it's all nuts. Humor is an important part of this work, she says. I'm trying to create a collision between the hilarious and the tragic. And then a New Yorker art critic also said about her, what can sell soap can smash sexism.
Yeah, and I was bummed that I ended up putting in the title a man's words about her work, but it was just such a good way of summarizing what she does. But I love this idea that she's talking about relationship and um, difference and and of course the collision between the hilarious and the tragic. That like seems like the most Jewish thing that anyone ever said. I'm trying to create a collision between the hilarious and the tragic. That is like how many thousands of years of Jewish history of like, this is so unfortunate and so tragic and so hard to deal with. I have to like make it funny in some way. So in that way, using words and images about social tragedy and making it funny, that just seems super Jewish. Any responses to any of these? Oh, yeah, how much time should I say I have left?
We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to look at the student work that you have.
Okay, so let's do it. Let's move forward.
Okay.
So again, what we did was I gave the kids the piles of magazines, and I used her white on red font. I think it's like Futura Bold. I looked it up. That's her font. I think so. And I printed out just a gazillion, not a gazillion. I looked for provocative Torah texts and texts that I thought they would know, and just put them next to. So I spread the magazines all around the room, and then put just a list of texts on a table, and I said, I'm going to step back and let you do what you do. And because it's a fine rabbinic midrashic tradition to match up texts that aren't next to each other, like we'll take a Genesis text and a Numbers text and put them together and make another point, right? Rabbis are much more creative than they sometimes let on, in messing with the text to make it say what they want it to say. I said, you guys feel free to cut up the text that you see and put them together with the images in any way that you want. And I just stepped back and let them do that. So here's some things.
So here's the first example.
Yeah. How many do we have total?
I have 3.
Okay, so I think we should just kind of take them in a few seconds at a time.
Yeah, we can talk about them one at a time if we want, if that's easier.
Oh, is that good? Okay.
Yeah. So Susan's saying that this piece of student work reminds her of the silly mitzvah of the widow's husband's brother taking off her shoe.
Yeah, so that's what this is. So this is a direct quote. I mean, it's a translation, but it's a direct quote from the Torah. That's what I did. I took Torah quotes and put them in Kruger font, and this particular student saw this picture and matched it up, and I think this this is like really spot on to match up the picture with the words in a humorous way, because you imagine this woman is like, oh, my husband's brother. I'm just imagining you've got a text in which the woman is the object, right? The husband's brother, the brother of the dead husband, God forbid, marries the woman. And here we've got, I imagine her like thinking like maybe her brother-in-law is more appealing or enticing than her current husband. So I love this one because it totally turns the mitzvah on its head. Whether or not we feel it is a mitzvah is another story, but yeah.
The other thing that strikes me about this image is just because it's her face and you can just see her. Normally, when we're reading this text, it's like in the Tanakh, right? So we're having our kids, or we've given them, so they're looking at the Tanakh, or they're looking at a translation we've printed out for them, And so they're reading the text, and it's not illustrated, right? So there's like something to me that's really powerful and makes me like feel more uncomfortable reading this when I feel like she's there, and like I feel like the person we're talking about is there looking at me. And I feel a little bit of shame about this quote when she's just right there.
Right. It forces you to engage with the Torah in a way that you might, this can't be as much of an intellectual exercise if you see an actual woman who would actually have to marry her brother-in-law.
All right, here's the next one. So Susan writing in ego with a lot of ellipses afterward. Frances writing in that there are so many possibilities for this also with her interfaith literacy course, since so many of the Christians in her course cite Bible chapter and verse. Paula is writing in, the problem with this image is that she loves Beyonce, so what is she supposed to do? And Susan holding up that on the other side of that, right, where one of the things that you talked about at the beginning of this, Mike, was idol worship and smashing idols and thinking about that when we're looking at these kinds of images.
So just for people who aren't as cool as Paula, this is Beyonce. She is, she's everywhere, so a lot of people probably know who she is. But she is she's gotten to this sense of a little bit of like an otherworldly figure of somebody who's an amazing singer and a great dancer and beautiful in a lot of people's eyes. And she's a feminist icon. So this is powerful, and this is a really good question, Paula, because she is raised up as a feminist icon, but she doesn't look like Bella Abzug, Like, she's, visually stunning, right? And that's tough. What do you do with that? And this was a good conversation that came out of the student work, like women and girls who are empowered by Beyonce, but she's judged as very visually appealing. Her husband is also very powerful, but not as considered as visually appealing as she is, right? So, that's tough.
Well, I also feel like we can turn it around and think about Beyonce as somebody who has really put like her goals and her career and what she wants first and really thought about herself as like she markets herself, and she totally buys into that and benefits from that system. But there's also something like, if Beyonce is saying this, there is no God but me, I think there is something for me empowering in that of like, I have to put myself first. I'm the most important person. That in a society where women are constantly told not to put themselves first or shamed from doing that, I think there's something powerful about that too.
Oh yeah, totally. I didn't want to. Thanks for reminding me that. I don't want to skip over that. Like, I love Beyonce. She's totally fierce, right? Like she is all those things, and talented and amazing at what she does, and has control over a lot of what she does in the world. But then is the only reason that she has got that possibility in the greater world of being seen that way is because of her being judged as visually appealing, right? And then there's the issue of who's saying this, right? Like, is she saying that? Is somebody else saying that about her? There's a lot of conversation that comes out of the connection of this image to that text.
Yeah. I also want to hold up a couple of ideas that have popped up in the chat. So including one about talking about celebrities in the Bible and the influence of fame and how they would be like as celebrities today, how we would understand them. And then Frances sharing this idea of taking female characters from the Bible and thinking about how they might be depicted in modern media. So taking them out of their biblical setting and putting them into the setting that we're critiquing. Okay, we have one more picture here. So Susan holding up that this image makes her think about sex slavery, and it makes her feel that she doesn't like it, makes her feel uncomfortable. And Paula saying that she thinks Eve was a slave to Adam in Eden. So pulling out that story.
For some people, I think, getting the Garden of Eden imagery from using that floral background, I think, super powerful.
I will just say one other thing, which is I think so I totally didn't get the Garden of Eden the first 25 times I looked at this image. Because I go on the Tumblr that you made and I look at these all the time because they're so cool. And one of the things that I thought was most powerful about this lesson is that in the making of the art, we are given the opportunity to really evaluate and deeply understand how our students are engaging with what we're teaching them. And it's so hard, especially in a supplemental school setting, to find a way to evaluate student learning, that if we have our students create pieces like this and then have them talk about it a little bit, it really helps us, A, learn something for ourselves, but B, really understand what it is our students are taking away from what we've put in front of them and ask them to engage with.
Yeah, it was super powerful. I think, you know, the other part was that just giving them time to look around and look at images and look at text is not something we often afford our kids. It's often like, this is the text and this is the opinion, or this is the text and these are the two opinions you could have, right? And we're doing great if we've got an argument between two opinions, right? Like, that's a success. And here, it was totally open-ended, and that overwhelmed some of the kids. In fact, I might use fewer texts if I did it again, or when I do it again, because it was a lot. But the idea that they didn't have to fit into any categories that I created. They just needed to pick a picture and mess with the text and put it together in any way they wanted to. I thought that was, I think the feedback I got was that it was very empowering, even though they didn't use that word.
Yeah, so Miriam writing in that examining advertising should also be part of secular school curricula, although the phrases from scripture would have to be eliminated. And there are certainly other texts that we could use if we were teaching in a secular setting that might be more comfortable or appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what Kruger does. I mean, you could imagine just taking things from the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, what's that? You know, inalienable rights.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
So before we close, I want to give people, the participants on the call, the opportunity to write in questions. What questions do you have for Rabbi Mike about, or what ideas, besides a lot of people have thrown out ideas, but what ideas do you have for using this in your communities? Great. So Miriam saying... Miriam saying she's going to...
I'm happy to share it.
Yeah, and actually the lesson is available online. So I'm definitely going to send the link on next week sometime. You all will get an email from us with the information with links about this. I'll also find some background articles on the art pieces that are featured here so that you all can get some context for that, and then it'll be much easier to share with other educators and people in your communities. Frances also saying this will work really well for her online interfaith literacy class with 80 students, that she's always looking for hands-on graphic projects. Yeah, and there are probably some great online tools that you can use for that, Frances. So if you need help finding those, feel free to reach out to us. And Paula saying that her friend is developing a class on Judaism and feminism, and she'd love to introduce the two of you. So, and Susan saying maybe in a confirmation class using this. So you've inspired a lot of ideas.
Fantastic.
So before we close, I just want to say a few words about our Twersky Award, which is for educators who are working with students in grades 6 through 12. We have 2 prizes this year for the first time for both a winner and a finalist, and there's still a whole month until the deadline. So, so you can get your lesson plan together over the next couple of weeks and still submit. There are a bunch of different components that we ask people to provide, though most of them, if you're teaching an original lesson, you're creating a lot of these things already, but these are the pieces that we ask people to include when they're submitting a lesson. And I'll also email you all the information about how to do this. And we've had a wide variety of lessons submitted to the award. In addition to Rabbi Mike's lesson, we've also had people using Twitter and asking their students to reimagine examples of Jews participating in justice activism as they were live tweeting what they were doing. So the students were looking at historical documents and then writing tweets. People who had students look at labor activists and read about the experiences of workers, and then in addition to looking at the primary source documents, also did a simulation of having to sew a certain amount of buttons in a certain amount of time or else they wouldn't get their snack. That was for a slightly younger crowd. And then teachers who have dressed up in costume and read texts aloud in order for their students to engage with them in a different way. So thank you all for coming. It was really wonderful to have you here. Thanks so many times over to Rabbi Mike for being a brilliant educator and for taking the time to lead this program today. And I hope that all of you will go and put these ideas to work in your community and then come back and tell us about how it went and what you learned and what we can learn from your work. So thank you, everyone.